So then the next chapter in Derrida's Grammatology is chapter 3, and it's called Grammatology as a Positive Science. And in this chapter now, what Derrida wants to do is to characterize grammatology as a science that basically he's inventing, that's in opposition to traditional logocentric forms of science. And what I want to talk about in this chapter in particular is the middle discussion in the chapter, Science in the Name of Man, in which he discusses his grammatology versus traditional logocentric forms of science as a conflict between linear and nonlinear forms of writing. And he especially characterizes, and this is a key point I think to get about what Derrida is doing, he especially characterizes grammatology as something that is nonlinear, and that's of its essence. So what he does here is he says that the thing about the logocentric tradition is that it's been a linear tradition. And it's a linear tradition, especially with phonocentric writing of the type that begins to come in about 2000 BC with the alphabet, with the Greeks and the Hebrews. And with the advent of phonocentric writing, we begin to get the suppression of the pluridimensionality, as he puts it, of nonlinear forms of writing. And by nonlinear forms of writing, he means presumably all forms of writing prior to the alphabet, especially things like Egyptian hieroglyphics and Chinese pictographs and any kind of writing of that nature that's identified or identifiable with what you might basically call, invoking Gebser, the mythical consciousness structure. Now, Willem Plusser has an interesting discussion of this in his books, in Does Writing Have a Future? And in his other book, Into the Universe of Technical Images, where he talks about how the thing about writing is that writing came into being as a means of dismantling images. It came into being first, when it came into being, it inaugurated history. It brought about history. To write is to record events, and historical consciousness is a literate consciousness par excellence. And I think that would be consistent with what Derrida is saying here about the logocentric tradition, especially forms of alphabetic writing. The Greek and the Hebrew traditions in particular, basically what they do, in the mythical world, everything runs around in circles. In the mythical consciousness structure, it's based on two-dimensional circles. Everything is based on the myth of the eternal return. The universe is created, it's destroyed, it's created again. In the imagination of the great Mahayugas of Indian philosophy, even in Greek philosophy, the Greeks retain this idea of the cyclicities of the cosmos. Everything runs around in circles in the mythical consciousness structure, and it's two-dimensional. But what writing does is it downloads and flattens out these circles that are running around, cuts them and flattens them out and transposes them onto surfaces of inscription in one-dimensional lines that then begin to cut apart and dismantle the images, thus neutralizing them. We get out of this tradition of the neutralizing and the criticism of images the Greek tradition of the pre-Socratics on the one hand and the Hebrew tradition of the prophets on the other. The Hebrew prophets are basically anti-imagistic men. They are their whole worldview is based on criticizing images, the worship of idolatry, and so forth. So writing is this, especially alphabetic writing, phonetic forms of writing, which is basically, I think, what Derrida means here by the origins of the logocentric tradition. It's basically the mental consciousness structure. It's equivalent with Gebser's mental consciousness structure, in which the primary structure of the logocentric tradition that begins with the pre-Socratics is the line with a capital L. Everything is flattened out and subordinated to linearity, to the line. We think of the fact that, for example, writing was invented by the Greeks, the way we read it today, moving from left to right, first with boustrophodon, which is a form of writing in which you read from left to right and then from right to left on the next line and then left to right after that line, the way an ox plows a field in a linear fashion. And the Greeks invented this left to right form of writing. Eventually it just stabilized into pure left to right. But that was something that the Greeks invented, and it is the subordination of nonlinearity to the tyranny of the line. Same thing with the Hebrew vision of the cosmos, in which the cosmos for the first time ever is seen as a non-cyclic thing. As something, as a process that occurs once and one time only, with a genesis and an eventual apocalypse, an eventual ending, and it's going to be, both events are singularities. They're not something, as in the Hindu tradition, that's going to keep recurring and recurring and recurring. This is the manifestation of the mental consciousness structure that brings in the line and subordinates all of these other forms of meaning. So what happens in these great logocentric traditions is that they suppress meaning. The great logocentric traditions, I made a note here, made meaning possible precisely by restricting it. And so when they restricted meaning, what they did was they brought, in the beginning basically, and this is what Derrida means by différence, by the trace, you have all of these different kinds of meanings running around like delusion uncoded flows. They're running around in an anarchic sense, meaning everywhere, traces everywhere. And then gradually what happens is that with the rise of a great logocentric system, let's say like Judaism or let's say like Islam, you begin to get the suppression of all of these other traces of meaning, the suppression of all these other signifiers, and just a few large iconic signifiers emerge in polar opposition, nature, culture, or let's say in the Islamic tradition, all the traces of meaning that have to do with women get repressed and subordinated, and you get a logocentric idea that comes in which women are dominated. They fall out. But all these other meanings that were there originally as the play of signification as différence, and différence is the matrix of signification, has all these other meanings in the form of traces that are still there in the system as traces. And this is what Derrida as a grammatologist, as a deconstructionist, is trying to find. He's going into these systems and pulling them apart to find all these other traces of all these other significations that have been repressed precisely so that these great single iconic systems could come into being based on their repression. And so what Derrida is doing, it's a little bit like he's playing the role of a dragon slayer insofar as we think of the Babylonian myth of Marduk, the great solar hero, slaying Tiamat, the great dragon, and building the cosmos out of pieces of her body. What Derrida is doing is something similar to that. He's pulling apart the mental consciousness structure, the logocentric tradition. He's like a dragon slayer, attacking it, slaying it, and pulling it apart in order to unleash all the traces that have been suppressed beneath the lines, as it were, by the tyranny of the line, so that they can run around and play. So now we have the play of signification, and it's endless. We have all these different forms of meaning that come squirming out from underneath these shattered lines that Derrida has gone in and ruptured, like with a sonic blast, the way that the walls of Jericho come down when the horn is blown, or at the end of time when Gabriel blows the horn and announces the end of the world. Derrida really is bringing in a tradition that brings down the lines, all the lines that have suppressed and subordinated all the meanings, all the traces that were there, the play of signification that were there in the beginning, and he's unleashing them, and now they're squirming and swarming all through his text in a way that's not that dissimilar from Joseph Finnegan's Wake. I think Finnegan's Wake is one of his great models for the play of signification. Multiple meanings in every word, multiple meanings in every line, traces everywhere. The trace is basically the collective unconscious of language. It's all the meanings that are in there that still exist as hidden signifiers that have to be dug up and out by pulling the systems apart. And so this is what has happened. And so in Derrida's discussion here we have the identification of logocentrism with the line, with linear writing, and it was built up as a means of suppressing non-linear forms of writing because they are pluridimensional. And he sees what he is doing precisely by dissolving the tyranny of the line. And in doing that, all the play, all the traces come forth, and we get his great papers like the paper Dissemination, in which he talks about the text is something that is based on, it's almost as though it were a set of Chinese boxes of text within text within text within text to infinity. There's meaning everywhere, and texts contain and fold other texts inside them. To write, he says famously in that essay, Dissemination, is to graft. And there he invents the concept of the graft, which is to say that anytime you cite a work, you create a sort of crease in that work that folds another text on the inside of it. And so in text, what we really have, in the absence of a transcendental signified, where the signifiers no longer refer outside the text to the great cosmology and the ontology of logocentrism that the whole text is a concrete media manifestation of, in the absence of that, what we have is intertextuality. Texts refer to other texts ad infinitum. Every text refers to another text. The play of signification of différence is text folded up, like the cut-up novels of William Burroughs, texts that are folded up inside of other texts within text within text. To cite a text is to fold it up into your text, and in doing that, you're changing the meaning of that text, and that text is changing the meaning of your text, and we get this infinite play of intertextual signification that is basically dissemination, and by dissemination he means the proliferation of meaning, the profusion and slippage of meaning. It's not something that can be trapped and nailed down in a linear fashion. And Derrida becomes, over time, as you read him, he becomes less and less linear. Even Grammatology here is still a good old-fashioned linear book by comparison to his later writings, like Dissemination and the Double Session and Gloss itself, in which he begins to dismantle the line, dismantle the mental consciousness structure, which is basically pulling apart. And as he dismantles it, he starts writing in the margins, he puts texts alongside of other texts, and does all these creative avant-garde things that represent the disintegration of linearity. So he's basically announcing the death knell of the logocentric tradition. The end of the book is the end of a particular way of writing, the way of writing in terms of the line, and this based on the suppression of traces. He wants to dismantle the line and invent a new form of writing in which the traces are set free like uncoded flows in a delusion cosmos, and run rampant with meaning everywhere. And so that's what you find in Derrida, is this continual play of signification when all the restrictor valves of language have been unleashed. Those things which have repressed ideas in the Western tradition, the repression of women, the repression of myth, the repression of the mythical consciousness structure, that all comes out. For example, in Joyce in Finnegan's Wake, the mythical consciousness structure comes back up. But Derrida is careful to say in this text, in this chapter, that he's not just, his work does not just amount to a regression back to the mythogram, as he calls it, borrowing a term from Louis-Durand, the mythogram, which is to say the mythical consciousness structure. He's not just regressing back to that. It is something new. It is the play of différance, and différance is the matrix of signification. And so that's the gist of this chapter. The most important point of it is this collision between linear systems of writing and nonlinear writing, and how he sees the logocentric tradition as a tradition of the erection of linear forms of writing based on the suppression of the pluridimensionality of nonlinear forms of writing that he's trying to unleash and restore in a certain sense.